Remember the war's start, Russian troops still occupy a part of the Kiev region. Russian television channels are filled with triumphant stories about the imminent fall of the Ukrainian capital. And also remember who was the main hero of those stories. The lion's share of the glory went to the Akhmat regiment. Russian propagandists most frequently praised the valor of this regiment, greatly irritating many correspondents in the combat zone. But after 1,000 days of war, the situation hasn't really changed much. At the beginning of the same Kursk operation of the armed forces of Ukraine, the main and only media defender of Russian land once again turned out to be the commander of Akhmat. Abdi Alaudinov, who has given and continues to give interviews, appears and keeps appearing on federal channels, informing the public about the course of military operations. Although, as we know, his unit, to put it mildly, tries to avoid the front line, which is acknowledged by Russian war correspondents. And so the question arises, why did the Kremlin rely on the Kadyrovites, and why does it continue to do so? Why, in fact, is Lieutenant General Alaudinov the only prominent military commander in the media? Just think about it. There are simply no other famous military figures in the Russian mass media. But why does the Kremlin deliberately portray the non-fighting Kadyrovites as defenders of the fatherland, when this actually increases interethnic tensions among Russians who are really fighting? Let's talk about this. I won't be introducing myself.
Russian President Vladimir Putin praised Chechens for their heroism and courage during the special operation.
They are versatile frontline soldiers who launch and shoot down drones, destroy targets, anticipate enemy maneuvers, and put them at a disadvantage. The Akhmat unit is made up of highly skilled, well-trained, and brave fighters. Akhmat Special Forces drone operators constantly monitor the sky, targeting mainly infantry. They continuously devise new tactics to surprise the militants.
Chechen Special Forces, our unit, strike the most fear in nationalists and fascists. In the Chechen Republic, serving in the security forces is deemed the highest honor.
Alexander Bogomaz emphasized that these courageous people, real heroes, are working to ensure the safety of Bryansk Oblast and the entire country. Many Chechen fighters are on the front lines, defending their homeland's borders and standing up for the country's interests. The Special Purpose Unit Saver Akhmat, established just over a year ago, has proven its effectiveness in carrying out combat missions in the Special Military Operations Zone.
It is also striking that national heroes are being made out of Kadyrov's men at a time when the level of interethnic tension in Zedi society is objectively quite high. This is not a Ukrainian information and psychological operation. At one point, all the Russian military channels are discussing how locals in Anapa got beat up by Aludinov's relative while trying to defend him. Then it turns out that through various Akhmat regiments, thieves-in-law are being released, and this has become a regular process. For example, the crime boss Emin Akhmedov, who was serving a sentence for contract killing, was released under the so-called Chechen scheme. It works as follows. You need to pay about $1 million to the Kadyrov Foundation and sign a contract with the Akhmat regiment. Then you stay in a rented apartment in the Rostov region for 6 months, waiting for your contract to end. After that, you are free and also considered a hero of the special military operation. The fugitive treasurer of Adam Delimkanov, Beslan Karimov, spoke about this scheme, through which criminals end up free and the Kadyrov family gets richer. So once again, this is not PSYOPs.
He got a job, what's his name, Alihan, as the deputy of this son. His father has been on the run for 25 years. Well, my sister's husband, my brother-in-law, he's our brother-in-law. He literally settled this issue just yesterday. No need to go anywhere. We have guys in the Bryansk region. He will be at home for several months, then he will be sent. There are guys there who basically live like they're at a resort. They rent an apartment, bring women over. To the front lines, that's completely out of the question. For Alihan's father, they said 8 months. So 4 months at first. If everything goes well, 4 months. If there are any issues, you never know. Then 8 months maximum in a row, but he doesn't have to go anywhere.
Then more and more details start appearing online about how Kadyrov's men, those close to the head of the republic, begin to encroach on the holiest of holies, trying to take control of oil production and refinement.
I'm walking past the grocery store with my 3 children. 2 Chechens are walking by. A man whistles at me as I walk. I confront him, asking if he's whistling at me. He responds, "What, is that not allowed?" No, it's not allowed. Think about your mother and sister at home. Do you understand the implications of this? He tells me I work at an oil refinery. Well, let the oil refineries allocate for the people they bring here.
Kadyrovtsi have seized control of the Krasnodar oil refinery, terrorizing local residents and sparking protests. The same situation is happening with oil depots in the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug. Kadyrovtsi are actively reviving the practice of protecting various businesses, and they are not hiding it at all. Everyone was watching the attempt to take Wildberries under control. Of course, there is nothing new about any of this. It's an open secret that the head of Chechnya is expanding his business empire, and almost always by illegal means. This photo shows the main entrance of Ilyich, one of Ukraine's largest metallurgical plants, located in occupied Mariupol. Kadyrov and the inscription Akhmat power might seem unrelated, but it's quite simple. The degenerates from the so-called Donetsk People's Republic laid down their lives in Mariupol so that the plant would end up in the hands of a Chechen businessman close to Ramzan Alashu Dadashev. In fact, the entire multi-billion business related to metal production in the occupied Ukrainian territories ended up in the hands of the Kadyrov clan.
Kadyrovsky, is that a soldier of Kadyrov? Do you also think that they are criminals because of the war?
They act like a separate state. They do whatever they want. They don't answer to anyone. They do whatever they want. They live by their own laws. That's how it is. They made up their own law, and that's the law they live by.
Maybe someone doesn't know, this was Magomed Gadzhiev, who fled from Russia in 2023. A State Duma deputy, initially a strong supporter of the special military operation, assisted Russian fighters and Donetsk occupation authorities at the war's start. However, after a conflict with Suleiman Karimov and other issues, the deputy fled Russia. But we are interested in him as a person who is deeply immersed in the inner workings of North Caucasus rulers. As you may have heard, he confirms that Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of Chechnya, is gaining agency by seizing assets. But the main thing is that as he expands his resource base, he increasingly begins to gain political weight as well.
The people who are at the top, the investigative bodies led by Bastrykin and Kolokoltsev, they are not sitting in their own places.
Yes, you've likely heard of Kadyrov's public attack on Investigative Committee head Bastrykin and Ministry of Internal Affairs head Kolokoltsev. The formal reason for Ramzan's indignation was the criminal case opened against a 14-year-old Chechen teenager, Muslim Murdiev, who allegedly or not allegedly harassed his peers and then beat them up. I'm saying allegedly, not to defend Murdiev, but because cases like this just look ridiculous. The Ministry of Internal Affairs overlooks Kadyrov's men openly engaging in racketeering and contract killings. Charging a 14-year-old for a fight is apparently always fine, but that's beside the point. What's interesting here is something else. Kadyrov's intervention on part of the teen isn't out of solidarity with a fellow citizen or a charitable act to protect a child. Of course, this is about earning political points among Muslims. This is something we've talked about many times already. Ramzan is a cunning and calculating individual who shouldn't be underestimated. The case with Murdiev is an opportunity to create an image of himself as the defender of all Muslims, because in this speech he acts as an advocate not only for Murdiev but also for migrants from Central Asia.
I was personally present when two presidents, the Uzbek and the Russian presidents, were talking about the migration of Uzbeks to Russia. We need to find common ground. It would be good if Uzbeks living here were not disturbed, so that they are not disturbed either, and so that we can find a common language and a joint solution together.
That is, you see, Kadyrov is becoming the protector of all Muslim brothers in Russia, and together with the migrants, there are about 25 million of them. Just think about it. That's not a bad electoral base. At the same time, Ramzan is clearly reaching a new level, making a move against Putin's ministers. For the most part, this is the first time the head of Chechnya has allowed himself to make a move against the top echelon of power. And I want to emphasize once again that such audacity does not go unnoticed by so-called Russian patriots who are building up resentment over all the antics of their Caucasian brothers. Here is, for example, a statement by Española, a member of a Russian terrorist formation fighting in Ukraine. Española, for those who don't know, is an organization of Russian right-wing football fans who went to the front. And here's what they write. Days after the 95th Region heads offensive remarks toward the Russian Interior Minister and Investigative Committee Chief, the military group Española feels necessary to intervene in the conflict. We consider it our duty to express words of support to Vladimir Kolokoltsev and Alexander Bastrykin. The military organization Española, together with all our support structures and the fan communities that back us, believes that Ramzan Akhmatovich Kadyrov should apologize for making insulting remarks towards the heads of the security agencies. In the past few days, none of the federal-level officials have commented on Kadyrov's outrageous statement. Only two regional deputies, Kusmakov and Klimov, have demanded that the Chechen leader apologize to Bastrykin and Kolokoltsev. It didn't even take 2 days for reports of psychological pressure being put on these Krasnodar deputies to start coming in. We are outraged that within the framework of a united and indivisible Russia, the sole head of a region repeatedly speaks out in defense of individuals involved in criminal cases. And everything else was along the same lines. Once again, I'm saying this because Kadyrov's behavior, as he gains more and more political agency, is increasingly irritating Russian fighters. Notably, numerous war correspondents have reported that Kadyrov's troops are not engaged in frontline combat. After information surfaced about how thieves-in-law are being released through the Akhmat Regiment. Abdi Alaudinov narrowly missed the armed forces of Ukraine in Kursk region. That's after Kadyrov defended migrants, criticizing ministers of the Investigative Committee and Ministry of Internal Affairs. One thing remains unclear. Why does the Kremlin continue to use the mass media to create the image of Kadyrovites as the main defenders of the fatherland?
A hero of the Donetsk People's Republic and more, general, philosopher, my friend, and I am proud of this friendship, as I have said before. Now is really a time when everything becomes clear. This is good and that is evil. Everything becomes obvious. And there all these covers fall away and the truth is revealed. Abdi Aronovich, I'm very glad to hear from you. I understand that there's active combat work going on there now. It's a bit loud in your area today, so I understand, and forgive me for distracting you.
Abdi Alaudinov stands out as the sole military figure in Russian media with genuine media savvy. No one else compares. Either war correspondents from federal channels or occasional fighters who give 1 or 2 comments and then never appear on television again.
But why is that? Don't they understand in the Kremlin that this leads to discontent? They do.
Only sheep being led to slaughter who consider Ukrainians their main enemies are not a threat to Putin. But Russian military figures who have recognition and authority can become such a threat, just like Prigozhin did. I say Russians, not citizens of Russia, because even someone like Kadyrov, despite his inflated image, won't be able to rally them behind him. Similar to Prigozhin's actions, Abdi Alaudinov won't be able to lead a march on Moscow due to lack of support, primarily because of his nationality. You can't expect the warm welcome in Rostov that the people of Rostov gave to Yevgeny Viktorovich. No matter how much the idea of brotherly peoples is promoted in the Russian Federation, for Russians, Chechens will never be considered their own. They are still seen as outsiders and so on. That is exactly why they are not dangerous for Putin. But if, for example, on Solovyov's show every day there was some so-called Ivan Bagrov, a Russian officer who speaks the harsh truth and who actually took part in combat operations. As a backdrop to him, the bald, Botox-injected old man could have faded. And Putin must not have any competitors. All the glory should go only to him.
On this solemn day, Constitution Day, I want to wish you good health once again, good health, so that you remember that health is not your personal health, but the health of great Russia.
Moreover, Kadyrov, as he asserts, remains Putin's devoted infantry soldier. Actually, this is what explains his permissiveness. The Kremlin dictator truly believes that, if necessary, Akhmat's fighters will come to his rescue. After all, as we will find out later, Ramzan needs Vladimir Vladimirovich just as much as the other way around. Moscow tolerates Kadyrov's antics and allows him more leeway than others for this very reason.
But lately, it has also become obvious that Kadyrov is gradually trying to push the boundaries of what is allowed.
And the attack on Bastrykin himself, who has known Putin since the 70s, they were classmates at Leningrad State University, is clearly crossing a red line. So the question arises, with all these attacks, is the cunning and seasoned Emir of Chechnya simply probing the boundaries of what is allowed, or does he understand that the time has come to act more assertively?
That's how Ramzan is with Putin. As for everyone else, he doesn't acknowledge or consider anyone at all. If Putin is gone, they won't be there either, just so you understand. When Putin leaves, the Federal Security Service won't keep them around.
Are you serious?
Yeah, if Putin is gone, they're done for, that's it. They'll go live in Jordan or the United Arab Emirates. Only Putin is holding them there.
He's the last person they're not afraid of. Like, either they respect him or they're afraid of him.
They only talk to Putin, they tell everyone else to fuck off. They just kick the door open and go wherever they want.
These words from fugitive Deputy Gadzhiev, who has direct knowledge of the complex relationship between security forces and Kadyrov, only confirm the points discussed in this video. Ramzan knows that Putin, who mediates between clans, is not eternal. His protection will end eventually, so Ramzan must act preemptively. That's why he's building up his strength, creating a capable army, which I should note is not being used up in local assaults in Ukraine. He's expanding his business to ensure a steady income for his family. And now he's gaining political points among fellow believers by acting as a defender of all Muslims, including migrants. It should also be noted that this isolation of Ramzan is happening against the backdrop of drone attacks on various targets in Chechnya. Of course, all this doesn't add any points to the so-called guarantor of stability in this republic. Remember, we discussed that Kadyrov asked to deploy air defense systems on the territory under his control back in 2022, realizing that sooner or later something would start flying toward him. Of course, this preemptive measure was needed to show those around him that nothing had changed since the start of the war and that the situation was under his control. But as is already evident, Putin couldn't cough up an extra air defense missile system for Chechnya. This is despite the Russian army regularly using S-300 systems to terrorize the people of Kharkiv and other areas. It is indeed terror because the system has very limited accuracy against ground targets. So, Vlad has anti-aircraft systems for this purpose, but there are none to protect oil depots or other regions like Chechnya. And that's really very strange. If you look at the air defense coverage zone of Russia, you can see that the North Caucasus is completely deprived of air protection. But you know what's even stranger? What are the actual targets of these strikes? Throughout the war, Ukraine has rarely carried out strikes aimed at political rather than military objectives, such as the strike on the Kremlin. However, the selection of targets by the armed forces of Ukraine has primarily been out of military necessity. Ammo depots, oil storage, refineries, comms hubs, command outposts, etc. It's important to note that the Special Forces University in Gudemez, the Special Police Regiment in Grozny, and the one-story barracks of the Akhmat Grozny Special Mobile Unit are not considered legitimate military targets. However, the drones chosen for these targets clearly did not have sufficient warheads to inflict significant damage on them. These are not fragile oil distillation units, for which a small warhead would be enough. So the question is, what was the point? What is the purpose of this, and how many Kadyrovites could be eliminated using this method? And you know, as strange as it may sound, considering all the factors mentioned above, it could very well turn out that the main parties interested in such actions are, let's say, the adversaries of Ramzan Akhmatovich, who live not outside the Russian Federation but inside Russia. Drones began appearing in the North Caucasus Republic right after the attempted hostile takeover of Wildberries. Is it possible that someone from Ramzan's business competitors, for example, Karimov, who competed with him for an asset like Wildberries, and against whom Kadyrov declared a blood feud, could have donated for these very drones? But one thing you can be absolutely sure of is that the Emir of Chechnya himself understands perfectly well that his main enemies are inside Russia, not outside its borders. Actually, this is exactly what explains his attempt at political separation.
I am saying this officially. I am officially declaring a blood feud against Barakhoev, and if he doesn't prove it, also against Suleiman Karimov and Rizvan Kurbanov. Because I am a Caucasian, I am a Chechen, I am taking back what is mine. There are witnesses, people.
And of course, we shouldn't forget that Ramzan is actively building relationships with the outside world. He recently visited the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. He takes his son and successor Adam with him on these foreign trips. Notably, regional leaders, if they travel abroad, only visit conditionally friendly nations like those in the Commonwealth of Independent States. But for some reason, Ramzan has the opportunity to make friends with representatives of countries that, let's say, are in the sphere of interest of the United States of America. In Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, not to mention Turkey, there are American military bases. Of course, this doesn't mean that the head of Chechnya is looking for new patrons, but it's certain that he is trying to build connections with the larger Muslim world as a representative of Russian Muslims. But here's what's interesting. After the fall of Assad's regime in Syria, Turkey, which Kadyrov visited 2 months ago, turned into a state that not only helped to push Russians out of a strategically important place, but also became a dominion that is practically implementing its strategic concept of the Great Tyrann.
Well, I'm against Assad's policy.
Now a person has come who really supports the population. With him, I believe Russia should be an ally, and I think that would be the right thing to do.
He certainly changed his opinion, but what could be the reason?
What's happening around Syria? We all know very well that, let's say, under the guise of the so-called moderate opposition, terrorist organizations have also been prepared, both with the West and with Europe. And they absolutely have no intention today of spending more time, so to speak, in the states of Syria or Iraq. They have succeeded in creating a powerful terrorist organization. And now they are supposed to go back home and continue just as Al-Qaeda once did to carry out terrorist activities.
Yes, it's a quick transformation for someone who used to send his fighters to support Assad in Syria. What could be the reason behind such statements? After all, Ramzan is once again openly going against the Kremlin, admitting that Bashar Assad's regime, which survived thanks to Russian bayonets, was anti-people. And he calls Julani, the head of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a man who supports his own people. This, of course, is magnificent. This is at the very moment when all Russian propaganda is lamenting the loss of Syria, saying that militants supported by Ukrainians have taken their place.
Ukrainians are gloating, which is very unpleasant for us.
But I can't avoid the issue of Ukrainians here, when we more or less know who is sitting in which position there. I don't want to play into Budanov's hands, but it's impossible to avoid this issue. It's another matter that they were hired. They were hired by the Americans, an international group, a serious one, a very serious professional group, prepared this army. The Ukrainians played the role of hired specialists there.
In the last video, we discussed how Syria's fate would rely on its common citizens. And they really did have their say, which makes me infinitely happy. And the decisive chord was played by Recep Erdogan, who, as it turned out, really set himself the goal of restoring justice in this Middle Eastern country. Now his influence throughout the entire Sunni world is clearly growing. Of course, it's still too early to talk about plans for the establishment of the Great Turan, but there is no doubt that a powerful geopolitical entity is forming near the North Caucasus, headed by Turkey. And here's the question. Can Ramzan Kadyrov consider Ankara as a center of power capable of legitimizing his subjectivity? Definitely. The same deputy, Magomed Gadzhiev, said that the head of Chechnya owns a hotel on the coast of Antalya. And even Kadyrov himself changed his rhetoric towards Turkey and even visited it. His son Adam was in a well-known Turkish television show. And not so long ago, Ramzan didn't just speak unfavorably about Erdogan, he basically threatened him.
Kadyrov published his address on his Telegram channel. He claims that in Turkey, and I quote, they are sheltering terrorists who have committed crimes in Russia, and then these same people go on to slander the entire leadership of the country and the Republic online. The Russian regional leader threatened retaliation, including over a monument erected in Turkey to Dzhokhar Dudayev, first president of the unrecognized Ichkeria.
The reason for the threats is clear. There is a huge number of supporters of Free Ichkeria and critics of the Kadyrov regime living in Turkey. On the one hand, Erdogan has never openly spoken about the liberation of Chechnya from Russian oppression, although his position on this issue is clear. The fact that in 1996, the first park, named after Dzhokhar Dudayev, was revealed in Istanbul, and it was inaugurated by the then mayor of the city, Recep Erdogan, kind of hints that the North Caucasus has been and remains an area of interest for Turkey. Why even bring up 1996? Just look at how the official Turkish media are now covering the Russian-Chechen war, which began 30 years ago. They openly talk about the war crimes of the Kremlin regime in Chechnya and about the fact that no one has been held accountable for these atrocities. By putting restoration of constitutional order in quotation marks, they made it clear that they do not accept Russia's official stance on the matter, that the massacre in Chechnya was purely an internal constitutional crisis. Well, as you understand, the core of the Chechen opposition lives precisely in the country of the Crescent, and the fact that Ankara refuses to extradite fugitive Chechens to Russia clearly indicates that the project of the Great Turan has not been put on the back burner, and that the North Caucasus should join it.
But they will find workarounds and overthrow the regime, and blood will be shed, and Turkey will get involved. It is beneficial for her to become a regional power again, to present herself as a supporter of democracy. Here she is, helping to overthrow dictatorial regimes. At the same time, she will strike at the Kurds, who are in northern Syria, northern Iraq, and eastern Turkey. And by summer, a war against Iran will be brewing. The Middle East will be in flames, dragging our Caucasus region into the conflict.
In the previous video, we talked about how a new war in Syria would be beneficial for Putin. At the very least, the attention of the world community would be diverted to the Middle East. But the situation unfolded in the most favorable scenario for the Syrian people, who made their voice heard. As you understand, if this hadn't happened, the conflict really could have dragged on. But here's something else interesting. Turkey took Moscow into account, since Moscow had leverage over Ankara's sensitive points. For example, Putin pursued a very balanced policy toward the Kurds despite their cooperation with the Americans. It was Russia that played the role of mediator in the complex relations between Washington, Ankara, Damascus, and directly with the Kurds. The policy was complex and multifaceted. Turkey understood that if a conflict with Russia arose, Moscow could abandon neutrality and cooperate with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, considered a terrorist organization in Turkey due to its actions in southeast Syria. After a Turkish F-16 shot down a Russian plane, Moscow allowed the Syrian Kurds to open a representation in Moscow. In response, Ankara reported that Russia was delivering anti-aircraft weapons to the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Of course, Erdogan had to take these threats seriously, because once again, it was the Kurdistan Workers' Party that he considered the main challenge to his state.
Iraqi, Syrian, and Turkish Kurds all find themselves in very difficult situations due to challenges to their autonomy and ongoing conflicts in their respective regions. There are also problems with the Kurds who are in Iran. Russia and Assad have distanced themselves from this. For Russia, a strategic ally like Turkey is important. As we remember, Russia had colossal problems with Turkey a little over a year ago. After the Russian plane was shot down, relations began to improve, so Russia took a step back and stayed above the conflict.
Yes, after restoring relations with Ankara, Putin backed off on the Kurdish issue, but Erdogan understood that with a new round of conflict with Moscow, he could face a serious problem. Now that's almost it. We'll still see Turkey play its game with the Americans. Will Ankara be able to reach an agreement with Washington so that they stop supporting the Kurds? After all, it will depend on this whether Turkey will allow Russia to keep its military bases. Yes, as I said, it's more complex there than it may appear, but that's a discussion for another time. For now, let's assume that the great geostrategist has been thrown out of Syria, and now he no longer has the levers of influence he once had. And that means the Turkish Sultan can act more freely. Does this mean that Turkey will promote its interests in the North Caucasus? Well, it's already doing that. Does this mean that Kadyrov, realizing his vulnerability if Putin leaves, will try to cushion things for himself? Of course, yes. Does this mean that Turkey will finance separatism in the Caucasus? Most likely, no. But who knows how the situation will change in a year, 2 or 3? Just take a look at this photo. Ksenia Shoigu is the daughter of Sergei Shoigu, the former Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation and current Secretary of the Security Council of Russia. Do you know what she's showing? That's the wolf salute. It's the sign of the Turkish ultra-right paramilitary group, the Grey Wolves. It was these guys who, after a Russian plane was shot down by a Turkish F-16 shot at the Russian pilot as he was parachuting down.
And we shouldn't forget that the Grey Wolves fought in Chechnya against the Russian army until 1999.
And here Ksenia Shoigu is showing this sign for which you can even get fined in Europe. There's no conspiracy here like Shoigu being Tuvan, a Turkic ethnicity, meaning they're all working for Ankara. That's not the case here, it's about something else. Turkey, unlike Russia, has managed to form an ideology that is attractive to many modern Muslims and not only them. The concept of uniting all Turkic peoples resonates in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. There are also supporters of pan-Turkism in Russia. Right now, this is a marginal minority, but as Turkey's influence grows, this project will become more and more viable. And the fact that Kadyrov, who realizes that the rule of his patron Putin is limited by biological age and that after his death he will be left alone with the Federal Security Service, is clearly pushing him, not towards separatism, but towards gaining a distinct political weight. External support from Turkey or the Persian Gulf monarchies will certainly not hurt him. So whether Kadyrov will repeat the fate of Prigozhin or the fate of Assad, or whether he will be more cunning than both of them, we will, of course, see in due time. Exciting times are ahead.
Is it true that you once said that every Chechen must kill 150 Russians to get into paradise?
No, I said that back in 95 or 96, and I called on Chechens to kill as many as you can. I didn't say 100, 150, or 200. I said as many as you can. Back then, I openly called for jihad, but I never specified a number like 150.